Here's the start of the story. The morning had started like any other in the small, quiet town. The streets were buzzing with the usual hum of life. Neighbors exchanging greetings, shop owners preparing for another day of business, and kids laughing on their way to school. Among them was a boy named Liam, an unassuming teenager with a calm demeanor and a love for books. He often found solace in the town's library, where he spent hours diving into worlds far removed from his own. Today, however, Liam wouldn't make it to the library. As he walked along the main road, lost in thought, a police car slowed down beside him. He glanced over, a bit surprised but not alarmed. Two officers, both wearing the kind of stern expressions that seemed to come with their uniforms, stepped out. Their eyes scanned Liam with a mixture of suspicion and judgment that immediately made him uncomfortable. "Hey kid, but a minute." The taller of the two called out. Liam stopped and nodded hesitantly. "Sure, officer. Is something wrong?" he asked, his voice steady but polite. The officer didn't answer directly. Instead, he tilted his head toward his partner, who had already started rummaging through the trunk of the car. A sinking feeling settled in Liam's chest as the second officer approached, holding a pair of handcuffs. "You're coming with us," the tall officer said. "But why?" "I haven't done anything wrong," Liam protested, his voice tinged with confusion and fear. The officer didn't seem to care. "We got a report about someone matching your description. You'll answer questions down at the station." Liam tried to stand his ground, but his words were cut short as the handcuffs clicked around his wrists. A small crowd began to gather, their murmurs filling the air. Some seemed concerned, others curious, but no one stepped in to help. Among the onlookers was Mrs. Carter, an elderly woman who had known Liam since he was a baby. She called out, "This is a mistake. That boy has never caused trouble in his life." The officers ignored her. They loaded Liam into the back of the police car and drove off, leaving a cloud of dust and unanswered questions behind. At the station, the interrogation began. The officers bombarded Liam with accusations and insinuations, their words dripping with prejudice. They didn't care to hear his side of the story, nor did they offer him the chance to call anyone. To them, he was already guilty. "What were you doing walking alone like that?" One officer sneered. "Reading," Liam replied calmly. "I was on my way to the library." "Sure you were," the other officer mocked. Hours passed, and Liam remained trapped in the suffocating confines of the station. He was scared, but he refused to let it show. What the officers didn't know, and what would soon shake their entire world, was the identity of Liam's father. Liam's father was not just a man of influence. He was a man who had spent his life fighting for justice. He had dedicated his career to holding people like these officers accountable for their actions. And when he found out what had happened to his son, there would be consequences. Unaware of the storm they were about to unleash, the officers continued their questioning, oblivious to the fact that every second they spent mistreating Liam brought them closer to their reckoning. As the door to the interrogation room opened, the faint sound of a phone ringing echoed in the background. The officers exchanged confused glances. The voice on the other end of the line would set everything into motion. But for now, Liam sat in silence, his mind racing with both fear and hope. The story was far from over. Would you like me to continue the story or refine this part further? The officers stepped out of the interrogation room, leaving Liam alone for a moment. He sat quietly, his wrists aching from the tightness of the handcuffs and his heart pounding with unease. The small, dimly lit room felt colder than it should have, the walls pressing in on him. He replayed the events in his mind, trying to figure out why this was happening. He was just an ordinary kid. What could he possibly have done to warrant this kind of treatment? Meanwhile, outside the room, the officers were discussing their next steps. "You sure this kid's got something to hide?" the shorter officer asked, frowning. The taller one shrugged, his confidence unwavering. "Doesn't matter. We'll get to the bottom of it. Someone called in, and that's all the reason we need. But it wasn't all they needed, and deep down, they probably knew it. Still, they didn't seem to care. Their tone was casual, almost dismissive, as if they'd done this before and expected no consequences. What they didn't know was that Liam's father, Malcolm Hayes, was already on his way. Malcolm wasn't just a parent. He was a man who had built a reputation as a fierce advocate for justice. A prominent civil rights attorney with a track record of taking on cases that exposed corruption and systemic wrongdoing, Malcolm was the last person anyone would want to cross. Back at the station, Liam sat quietly, but his thoughts were anything but calm. He thought about his dad and the countless stories he'd heard about his work. Malcolm always told Liam to stand tall in the face of injustice, but it was easier said than done. Right now, Liam felt small, powerless, and scared. The door opened again, and the taller officer walked back in, a smug look on his face. He dropped a folder on the table in front of Liam. "We've been looking into you, kid," he said, leaning forward. "Doesn't look good." Liam frowned. "I don't understand." "What are you talking about?" The officer smirked. "You don't have to understand. You just have to answer our questions." The accusations were vague, the questions even more so, but Liam could feel the weight of their intentions. They weren't looking for answers. They were looking for something, anything, to pin on him. Unbeknownst to the officers, their actions had not gone unnoticed. Outside the station, a small crowd had begun to gather. Word had spread quickly through the town that Liam had been arrested, and people were starting to ask questions. Among them were a few of Liam's friends, who had gone straight to his house when they heard the news. When they arrived, Malcolm was already on the phone, his voice calm but firm as he spoke to someone on the other end. His expression hardened when he heard what had happened, but he didn't waste time on anger. Instead, he moved quickly, gathering information and making calls. By the time Malcolm stepped out of his house, he had a plan. He didn't know all the details yet, but he didn't need to. What he did know was that his son had been taken without cause, and that was enough to set things in motion. Back at the station, the atmosphere was tense. Liam's silence was starting to frustrate the officers, and their questions grew sharper, more pointed. "You think you're smart, don't you?" The taller officer sneered. Sitting there, acting all innocent. "I haven't done anything wrong," Liam said, his voice steady despite the fear in his chest. "Then why do you look so nervous?" "Because you arrested me for no reason," Liam shot back, his courage surprising even himself. The officer's face darkened, but before he could respond, the door opened again. This time, it was another officer, a younger one, with a hesitant look on his face. Sir? You might want to come out here," he said, glancing nervously at Liam before looking back at his superior. "What is it now?" The taller officer grumbled, following him out of the room. The sight that greeted him in the station's lobby was not what he expected. Malcolm Hayes stood there, his presence commanding despite his calm demeanor. Behind him was a small but growing group of concerned townspeople, their expressions a mix of worry and determination. Malcolm didn't waste time on pleasantries. "I'm here for my son," he said, his voice steady and unyielding. The officer hesitated, glancing at his partner, who had joined him in the lobby. They hadn't anticipated this. A father who not only cared, but had the means and the will to fight back. "You can't just walk in here and—" The shorter officer began, but Malcolm cut him off. "I can, and I will," he said firmly. "Unless you prefer to explain to a judge why you've detained a minor without cause." The tension in the room was palpable. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, realizing too late that they might have made a mistake. But they weren't ready to back down. Not yet. "Your son was brought in for questioning," the taller officer said, trying to sound authoritative. "We have procedures to follow." "Then you'd better start following them," Malcolm replied, his tone sharp. "Because as of now, You're in violation of several of them." The crowd outside the station continued to grow, their voices rising as they demanded answers. Inside, Liam could hear the commotion, but he didn't know what was happening. All he could do was wait and hope that his father would get there in time. The officers returned to the interrogation room, their frustration evident. "Looks like your daddy's here to save you," the taller one said, his tone mocking. Liam didn't respond, but the mention of his father brought a flicker of hope to his eyes. The tension in the station was reaching its breaking point. Malcolm wasn't leaving without his son, and the officers were running out of excuses. But even as they debated their next move, they couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. For Liam, the ordeal was far from over. But as he sat there, waiting to see what would happen next, he felt a small spark of resilience. He wasn't alone in this, not anymore. "Would you like me to continue building the story from here?" The silence in the interrogation room was deafening. Liam sat back in his chair, his mind racing. The officers' smug attitudes made it clear they thought they held all the power. But they didn't know his father like he did. Malcolm wasn't just a lawyer. He was a force of nature when it came to defending what was right. Liam took a deep breath, trying to hold onto that thought as the minutes crawled by. Outside, Malcolm's voice was steady but firm. He wasn't here to cause a scene. He was here to get his son back. The officers, however, were growing defensive. They didn't like being questioned, especially in front of an audience. "Sir, with all due respect, this is a police matter," the taller officer said, his tone condescending. "Your son was brought in based on a description from a reliable source." "And what exactly did that description entail?" Malcolm asked. His calmness was disarming, almost as though he were laying a trap. "Because unless it included a name, a concrete detail, or anything remotely specific, you've made an unlawful arrest. And trust me, I'll make sure the court knows that." The officer faltered for a moment, glancing at his partner for backup. The shorter officer stepped forward, trying to salvage the situation. "Look, we're just doing our job. There's been a string of thefts in the area, and your son happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. We're not saying he's guilty. We're just asking questions." "That's funny," Malcolm said, his voice icy now. "Because last I checked, questioning doesn't usually involve handcuffing an innocent boy, dragging him to a station, and holding him for hours without notifying his parents." The officers exchanged uneasy glances. The situation was slipping out of their control, and they knew it. But rather than admit fault, they doubled down. Inside the interrogation room, Liam could hear faint voices through the walls. He couldn't make out the words, but he recognized his father's tone. It was the same tone Malcolm used in court when he was building momentum in an argument. Liam allowed himself a small glimmer of hope. Meanwhile, back in the lobby, the crowd outside had grown restless. Several people had started recording on their phones, capturing every moment of the confrontation. Among them was a local journalist who had shown up after hearing about the incident. She'd seen stories like this before, and she knew how quickly they could spiral out of control. The journalist approached Malcolm carefully, introducing herself and offering her help. Malcolm gave her a nod of appreciation, but kept his focus on the officers. "You're putting yourselves in a deeper hole with every minute you keep him detained," Malcolm said. "Release him now, and maybe we can discuss this before it becomes a headline tomorrow." The officers hesitated, unsure of how to proceed. They had no idea that Malcolm's network extended far beyond the town. He had friends and allies in powerful places, people who would gladly shine a spotlight on their behavior if necessary. But this wasn't just about influence, it was about principle. Malcolm wasn't just fighting for Liam, he was fighting for every kid who had ever been mistreated by those who were supposed to protect them. As the standoff continued, another subplot began to unfold. In a nearby diner, two young men sat huddled in a booth, whispering nervously. They were the ones who had called in the false report that led to Liam's arrest. They hadn't expected things to escalate this far. I thought they'd just stop him, maybe scare him a little, one of them said, his voice shaky. Yeah, well, it's too late now, the other replied, glancing out the window. Do you see the crowd outside the station? This is getting out of hand. What if someone finds out we called it in? No one's gonna find out. Just keep your mouth shut. But their secret was already hanging by a thread. One of the waitresses had overheard bits of their conversation and was now watching them closely. She didn't know the full story, but something about their behavior didn't sit right with her. Back at the station, the tension reached a boiling point. Malcolm had had enough of their stonewalling. He leaned in closer, locking eyes with the taller officer. You have one last chance, he said quietly. Release my son now, or I'll make sure this becomes the most expensive mistake of your career. The officer opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the door to the station swung open. The young officer who had interrupted earlier stepped in again, looking more nervous than ever. Sir, he said, addressing his superior. There's a call for you. It's from the DA's office. The taller officer's face paled slightly. He gave Malcolm a lingering glare before turning to take the call. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Liam sat in the interrogation room, unaware of the chaos unfolding just a few feet away. He tapped his fingers on the table, his mind racing. He thought about what his dad always said about standing up for what was right, even when it was hard. Liam didn't feel brave, but he knew he couldn't let them see his fear. When the taller officer returned, his expression had changed. He looked less confident now, almost uncertain. Malcolm didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The officer's demeanor said it all. The other officer spoke up, his tone defensive. We'll let the kid go, but don't think this means. It means you know you're wrong, Malcolm interrupted. And it means this isn't over. The officers reluctantly agreed to release Liam, but the damage had already been done. As Malcolm walked out of the station with his son, the crowd outside erupted into cheers and applause. But Malcolm didn't stop to celebrate. He had work to do. This was only the beginning. Would you like me to continue with more details on the aftermath and the next twists? Malcolm and Liam walked away from the station, the crowd parting to let them through. The cheers and applause seemed distant to Liam, who couldn't shake the chill that had settled over him. He was free, but the weight of what had happened clung to him like a shadow. Malcolm kept a steady hand on his shoulder, guiding him toward the car. As they drove home, the tension in the car was palpable. Malcolm's usually calm demeanor was replaced with a quiet intensity. His mind was already racing with strategies, planning his next move. Liam, on the other hand, was overwhelmed. Dad, he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. Why did this happen? Malcolm glanced at him, his expression softening. Because some people abuse their power, son. But we're not going to let them get away with it. Liam nodded, but his father's reassurance didn't erase the fear that lingered in his chest. He stayed out the window, watching the familiar streets blur past. He couldn't help but wonder if his life would ever feel normal again. Back at the station, the officers were scrambling to contain the fallout. The call from the DA's office had rattled them more than they cared to admit. It was clear that Malcolm Hayes wasn't just another angry parent. He was someone with the power to make their lives very difficult. We need to figure out how this got so out of hand, the shorter officer muttered, pacing the room. It's not over yet, the taller one replied. We still have the report. We'll find a way to justify what we did. But even as he said it, doubt flickered in his eyes. The truth was, they had nothing solid, and they both knew it. Meanwhile, the two young men at the diner were growing increasingly nervous. Their earlier bravado had all but disappeared, replaced by a gnawing sense of guilt. What if they traced the call back to us? One of them whispered, leaning across the table. They won't, the other insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. But what if they do? You heard what the guy said. His dad's a lawyer. He's not going to let this go. Across the room, the waitress who had been watching them quietly stepped away from the counter. She had heard enough to piece together the basics of what had happened, and her conscience wouldn't let her stay silent. She picked up her phone and made a call, her voice low as she relayed what she had overheard. That call would set off a chain of events none of them could have predicted. At home, Malcolm was already on his computer, gathering evidence and reaching out to his network. He had spoken to a few trusted colleagues who shared his outrage and were eager to help. They advised him to act quickly, to make sure the truth came out before the officers could spin their version of events. Liam sat in the living room, staring blankly at the television. The day's events played over and over in his mind, each moment sharper than the last. He could still feel the cold metal of the handcuffs, hear the mocking tone of the officers' voices. His phone buzzed, breaking him out of his thoughts. It was a message from his best friend, Maya. Are you okay? Everyone's talking about what happened. I can't believe they did that to you. Liam hesitated before replying. He didn't know how to explain how he felt, but he appreciated her concern. I'm okay, he wrote back, though it didn't feel entirely true. Maya's reply came almost immediately. Let me know if you need anything. We're all there for you. The support meant a lot, but it also reminded Liam of how much attention this was getting. He wasn't sure if he was ready to face everyone yet. As night fell, the tension only grew. Malcolm received a tip from one of his contacts, a friend who worked in the DA's office. The officers were already trying to cover their tracks, tweaking the report to make their actions seem justified. It was exactly what Malcolm had expected, but it still infuriated him. They're not going to get away with this, he said aloud, more to himself than anyone else. The next morning, Malcolm and Liam woke to a storm brewing outside, both literally and figuratively. The local news had picked up the story, and reporters were beginning to sniff around for more details. The video footage from the crowd outside the station had gone viral overnight, sparking outrage online. Malcolm wasn't surprised by the attention, but he knew it came with risks. The court of public opinion could be a powerful tool, but it could also turn unpredictable. He needed to stay ahead of the narrative. He decided to hold a press conference that afternoon, determined to set the record straight. Liam wasn't sure he wanted to stand in front of cameras and microphones, but Malcolm assured him it was important. "This isn't just about you," Malcolm said gently. "It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." Liam nodded, understanding but still nervous. Meanwhile, back at the station, the officers were feeling the pressure. The taller one was on the phone, his voice tense as he spoke to someone higher up. "We didn't do anything wrong," he insisted. The kid matched the description. "We were just doing our jobs." But the excuses sounded hollow, even to him. The shorter officer, meanwhile, was scrolling through his phone, his jaw tightening as he read the comments flooding in online. The public wasn't buying their story, and the backlash was growing by the minute. As the day wore on, the tension reached a fever pitch. Malcolm's press conference was set to begin, and the crowd outside the venue was massive. Reporters, activists, and concerned citizens all gathered, eager to hear what he had to say. Liam stood beside his father, his heart pounding. He had never been in the spotlight like this before, and the sheer number of eyes on him was overwhelming. But he took a deep breath and reminded himself of what his dad had said. This wasn't just about him. Malcolm stepped up to the podium, his expression calm but resolute. He began to speak, his voice carrying the weight of everything they had endured. But just as the crowd began to settle, a commotion broke out at the back of the venue. Everyone turned to see what was happening, and the tension in the air grew even thicker. The moment was charged with anticipation, and no one knew what was coming next. "Would you like me to continue and build toward the climax from here?" The murmurs in the crowd grew louder as people craned their necks, to see what was causing the disruption at the back of the venue. Malcolm paused mid-sentence, his steady composure faltering for just a moment. Liam stood frozen, his eyes darting between the crowd and his father. Something wasn't right. Through the sea of faces, a woman emerged, her expression urgent. She carried an air of determination, their steps quick and purposeful as she approached the podium. The security team moved to intercept her, but Malcolm raised a hand to stop them. There was something in her eyes, something that told him she wasn't here to cause trouble. The crowd fell silent, the tension almost unbearable, as she reached the stage. Leaning in close, she whispered something to Malcolm. His expression shifted subtly, a flicker of surprise crossing his face before he quickly masked it. "Ladies and gentlemen," Malcolm said, his voice steady but tinged with a new edge. "It seems there's been a development. I'll address it shortly, but first, I'd like to hear what this young lady has to say." The woman hesitated, clearly not expecting to be put on the spot so quickly. She glanced nervously at the crowd, then back at Malcolm. With a deep breath, she stepped up to the microphone. "My name is Rachel," she began, her voice trembling slightly but growing stronger with each word. "I work at a diner not far from here, and yesterday, I overheard two customers talking about a false report they made to the police. They described your son, Mr. Hayes, down to the clothes he was wearing. They admitted to calling it in as a prank." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Cameras flashed as reporters scrambled to document every word. Malcolm's jaw tightened, his suspicions confirmed. Rachel continued, her voice growing steadier. "I didn't know what to do at first, but when I saw the news this morning, I knew I couldn't stay quiet. I'm sorry it took me this long to come forward." "Thank you, Rachel," Malcolm said, his tone measured. "It takes courage to do the right thing, even when it's not easy." The crowd erupted into a mix of cheers and murmurs as Rachel stepped away from the microphone. Malcolm turned back to address them, his voice rising above the commotion. "This revelation changes everything," he said. "Not only was my son wrongfully detained, but it was based on a fabricated report, a lie. This isn't just about one incident. It's about the systemic issues that allow this kind of injustice to happen." But before he could continue, another voice cut through the crowd, loud and confrontational. "Hold on a second." All eyes turned to the source of the voice. It was the taller officer from the station, flanked by his partner. They had just arrived, their faces tight with a mix of anger and unease. The officer strode toward the stage, his presence casting a shadow over the moment. "You don't get to twist this around," he said, his voice filled with defensiveness. "We acted on credible information. If someone lied to us, that's on them, not us." Malcolm didn't flinch. "Credible information. Is that what you're calling a vague description with no corroborating evidence?" The officer bristled, his authority challenged in front of such a large audience. "We followed procedure. If you have an issue, take it up with internal affairs." "Oh, don't worry," Malcolm shot back, his voice razor-sharp. "I intend to. But right now, the issue is that you arrested an innocent boy without cause, and you're trying to deflect responsibility instead of owning up to your mistakes." The crowd buzzed with tension, the atmosphere electric. The officers exchanged uneasy glances, their confidence wavering as they realized they were losing the crowd. But just as it seemed the confrontation had reached its peak, another twist emerged. From the back of the crowd, a man in a suit stepped forward. He carried himself with an air of authority, his expression unreadable. "I think we've heard enough," he said, his voice cutting through the noise like a knife. Malcolm recognized him immediately. It was the district attorney himself. The DA's sudden appearance sent shockwaves through the crowd. Even the officers looked taken aback, their postures stiffening as he approached the stage. "This situation has escalated far beyond what it should have," the DA said, addressing the crowd. "I've reviewed the initial report and the evidence, or lack thereof, provided by the officers involved. And I can assure you, Steps are being taken to address this matter appropriately. The taller officer started to protest, but the DA silenced him with a sharp look. We will conduct a thorough investigation into how this situation was handled, he continued. In the meantime, I'd like to personally apologize to Mr. Hayes and his son for the ordeal they've been put through. The crowd erupted into applause, but Malcolm remained guarded. While the DA's words were a step in the right direction, he knew better than to take them at face value. As the tension in the crowd began to ease, Liam stood quietly beside his father, still processing everything. The weight of the past 24 hours had taken its toll, but for the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope. But just as the crowd began to disperse, Malcolm's phone buzzed with a new message. He glanced at the screen, his expression darkening. "What is it?" Liam asked, noticing the change in his father's demeanor. Malcolm hesitated, then showed Liam the screen. It was an anonymous message, and its contents were chilling. Asterisk, "You've made a lot of noise, Mr. Hayes. Watch your back." Asterisk. The story wasn't over, not by a long shot. Malcolm stared at the anonymous message, his mind racing. He had expected pushback, but this was a clear threat. He wasn't about to let fear dictate his actions, though. If anything, it fueled his resolve. He quickly forwarded the message to one of his trusted contacts, a cybersecurity expert named Tony, with a simple note. Asterisk, "Can you trace this?" Asterisk. Liam watched his father, his own anxiety growing. "What does it mean? Are we in danger?" "We're fine," Malcolm said, though the edge in his voice betrayed his concern. "This is just someone trying to scare us. We're not backing down." As the day wore on, the story continued to gain traction. News outlets picked up Rachel's testimony, and the public outcry intensified. Social media was flooded with calls for accountability, with hashtags demanding justice for Liam. The officers, once confident in their ability to deflect blame, now found themselves under intense scrutiny. That evening, Tony called back with an update. "Malcolm, I traced the message to a burner phone, but I found something interesting. The phone was purchased near the diner where Rachel overheard the conversation. Whoever sent it might be connected to those guys." Malcolm's grip on the phone tightened. "Can you dig deeper?" "Already on it," Tony replied. "I'll let you know if I find anything else." The next morning, Malcolm received another call, this time from Rachel. Her voice was shaky, and he could hear the fear in her words. "Someone came to the diner last night," she said. "They didn't say anything, just sat at the counter and stared at me. I think they're trying to intimidate me." "Rachel, listen to me," Malcolm said firmly. "You're not alone in this. If you feel unsafe, I'll make sure you have protection. Don't let them silence you." Rachel agreed, but the tension in her voice lingered. Malcolm hung up, his mind working overtime. Whoever was behind this wasn't just trying to cover their tracks. They were actively targeting anyone who posed a threat to their version of events. Later that afternoon, Malcolm received a call from the DA. "Mr. Hayes, I wanted to let you know we've made some progress. We've reviewed additional footage from the station's security cameras, and it contradicts the officer's report. Based on this new evidence, we'll be placing them on administrative leave pending further investigation." Malcolm was relieved but cautious. "That's a start," he said. "But this goes beyond two officers. The entire system allowed this to happen. Are you prepared to address that?" The DA hesitated. "One step at a time, Mr. Hayes. Let's focus on the immediate issue for now." As promising as the news was, Malcolm knew the fight wasn't over. He also knew the anonymous threat couldn't be ignored. That evening, Tony called back with another update. "Malcolm, I think I found something." The burner phone was linked to a credit card used at a nearby gas station. The name on the card is connected to one of the guys Rachel described at the diner. Malcolm's heart raced. "Do you have an address?" Tony hesitated. "I do, but you need to be careful. These guys don't seem like they're playing around." "I'll handle it," Malcolm said, his voice steady. Malcolm shared the information with a trusted investigator, who confirmed the connection. The two men from the diner had a history of trouble with the law, including previous incidents of filing false reports. With this new evidence, Malcolm knew it was time to confront the situation head-on. The next day, the investigator, accompanied by local law enforcement, visited the address. The men were taken in for questioning, and under pressure, they cracked. They admitted to making the false report, thinking it would be a harmless prank. They claimed they had no idea it would escalate the way it did. As their confession made its way back to the DA, the case against the officers began to unravel. The public backlash grew louder, and calls for broader reform intensified. But just when it seemed the dust was settling, another twist emerged. Tony called Malcolm with one final revelation. "Malcolm, I dug a little deeper into those guys. Turns out, they didn't come up with this idea on their own. Someone put them up to it." "What do you mean?" Malcolm asked, his stomach sinking. "There's a third party involved," Tony said. "Someone who wanted to stir up trouble and use these guys as pawns. I don't have a name yet, but I'm working on it." The revelation hit Malcolm like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just about a false report or overzealous officers. There was a larger scheme at play, and the true mastermind was still out there. As the news broke about the confession and the subsequent investigation, Malcolm stood by Liam's side, proud of how far they had come. But in the back of his mind, he couldn't shake the feeling that the fight was far from over. The story had reached its climax, but the final chapter was still unwritten. Malcolm knew one thing for sure: whoever was behind this had made a grave mistake in underestimating him. In the weeks that followed, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The confession from the two men at the diner, coupled with the mounting public pressure, led to a series of rapid developments. The officers involved were officially suspended without pay, and the department announced a full internal review of their procedures. It was a small victory, but an important one. Malcolm remained focused, knowing there was still work to be done. Tony's discovery about a third party orchestrating the false report weighed heavily on his mind. If there was someone pulling the strings, they needed to be exposed. He spent countless hours following up with Tony and other investigators, determined to see this through to the end. Meanwhile, Liam started to feel a sense of normalcy returning to his life. Though the experience had shaken him deeply, the unwavering support of his father and the outpouring of public solidarity had given him strength. He went back to school, where his classmates treated him with a newfound respect. Teachers and administrators, aware of the ordeal he had endured, took extra care to create a supportive environment for him. Rachel, too, found herself in a better place. Her bravery in coming forward had not gone unnoticed, and several advocacy groups reached out to her, offering support and resources. She decided to leave the diner and take a position with one of these organizations, using her voice to help others who found themselves in similar situations. Despite these positive developments, Malcolm couldn't ignore the unanswered questions. Tony's investigation eventually led to a breakthrough. He identified the third party, a local businessman with a history of shady dealings. The man, it turned out, had a grudge against Malcolm, stemming from a previous campaign where Malcolm had exposed unethical practices in his company. The businessman had orchestrated the false report as a way to discredit Malcolm and create chaos in his life. With this revelation, Malcolm wasted no time. He gathered the evidence Tony had uncovered and presented it to the DA, who agreed to open a case against the businessman. The process was slow, as these things often are, but the weight of the evidence made it clear that justice would eventually prevail. As the dust began to settle, Malcolm took a moment to reflect on everything that had happened. The ordeal had been a painful reminder of the systemic flaws that still plagued society. But it had also shown him the power of resilience, community, and standing up for what is right. At a press conference held to address the outcome of the case, Malcolm stood before a crowd of supporters, reporters, and community members. He spoke with the same conviction that had carried him through the darkest moments of the ordeal. "This experience has been one of the most challenging of my life," he said. "But it's also been a reminder of why we fight for justice. It's not just about my son and my family. It's about creating a world where no one has to endure what we did. It's about holding people accountable and demanding better from those in power." The crowd erupted in applause, but Malcolm wasn't finished. "I want to thank everyone who stood by us. Rachel, who had the courage to speak out. Tony, whose skills helped us uncover the truth. And every single person who raised their voice in support. This is a victory, but it's not the end. It's a step forward, and we must keep moving." After the press conference, Malcolm and Liam returned home, where they finally allowed themselves a moment of peace. The journey had been long and exhausting, but they had come out stronger. Liam sat on the couch, scrolling through messages of support on his phone, while Malcolm leaned back in his chair, a rare smile crossing his face. "Dad," Liam said, looking up from his phone, "do you think this will really change things, like for other people?" Malcolm considered the question carefully. "I think it's a start," he said. "Change doesn't happen overnight, but every step forward matters. And as long as there are people willing to fight for what's right, there's hope." The next few months saw significant developments. The businessman responsible for orchestrating the false report faced legal consequences, and the police department implemented new training programs aimed at preventing similar incidents in the future. Advocacy groups used Malcolm and Liam's story as a rallying point, sparking conversations and initiatives across the country. For Malcolm, the experience reaffirmed his belief in the importance of community and accountability. He continued his work as an advocate, using his platform to shine a light on issues that needed attention. Liam, inspired by his father's resilience, began volunteering with youth organizations, determined to make a difference in his own way. In the end, the story wasn't just about a father and son overcoming injustice. It was about the ripple effect of standing up for what's right, the power of community, and the hope that even in the face of adversity, positive change is possible. As Malcolm looked out at the city skyline one evening, a sense of calm washed over him. The fight wasn't over. There would always be challenges to face and battles to fight. But for now, he allowed himself to savor the moment, knowing they had made a difference. And that, he thought, was what mattered most. For Malcolm, the experience reaffirmed his belief in the importance of community and accountability. He continued his work as an advocate, using his platform to shine a light on issues that needed attention. Liam, inspired by his father's resilience, began volunteering with youth organizations, determined to make a difference in his own way. In the end, the story wasn't just about a father and son overcoming injustice. It was about the ripple effect of standing up for what's right, the power of community, and the hope that even in the face of adversity, positive change is possible. As Malcolm looked out at the city skyline one evening, a sense of calm washed over him. The fight wasn't over. There would always be challenges to face and battles to fight. But for now, he allowed himself to savor the moment, knowing they had made a difference. And that, he thought, was what mattered most.